Her mop had been moving across that same corridor for 11 years when the woman in the fur coat kicked it out of her hands. Not an accident. A deliberate sideways sweep of a designer heel. The kind of movement a person makes when they do not consider what they are touching to be worth any caution. The mop handle hit the linoleum at 10:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, and the sound of it rang down the entire length of the East Corridor at Corlebu Teaching Hospital in Accra. Everyone heard it. Nobody moved. The woman in the fur coat did not look back. She continued toward the reception desk with her handbag swinging from the crook of her elbow, trailing a cloud of something that smelled like orange blossom and money, and she did not once check to see what had fallen or who had dropped it. She reached the front desk and placed both palms flat on the counter the way people do when they have decided the person behind the counter is going to do exactly what they say. Adeze picked up the mop from the floor. She had picked up worse things. She wrung it once over the bucket, set it back in motion, and did not stop working. But something in that corridor had shifted. The woman at the desk had not yet discovered it. And the name on the plaque at the far end of the East Wing, the one that had been there for 6 months, was about to become the most important thing in that building. What happened next was not what Mrs. Vivian Obeng Asante expected. It never is, for people like her. Adeze Mensah was 51 years old and weighed what she had weighed at 34, which was 54 kilograms, which was not an accident and not a gift. She had not eaten breakfast that morning. She did not eat breakfast on Wednesdays because Wednesday was the morning her granddaughter Afua needed bus fare and lunch money both. And there was not always enough for 3 different things before 8 o'clock. Adeze carried a purple flask of ginger tea in the front pocket of her cleaning smock and drank from it between corridors. The tea was her breakfast. It had been her breakfast on varying days of the week for the better part of 3 years. She had come to Corlebu 11 years ago on a temporary contract that became a permanent one because she was the only member of the cleaning staff who had never, in 11 years, called in sick. Not once. The administrative record existed somewhere in a file cabinet on the 3rd floor, not because anyone had looked at it recently, but because Adeze herself had asked the HR clerk about it 6 years ago, quietly, without explaining why. She had wanted to know that the record was there. She wore the same uniform as every other member of the cleaning staff, pale blue, slightly faded at the collar. But hers was pressed. Not ironed by machine, pressed by hand, with a damp cloth and the flat bottom of a pot she heated on the stove, the way her mother had taught her in Enugu when Adeze was 9 years old, and already learning that certain things could be controlled, even when most things could not. Every morning, she laid the uniform on the kitchen table and pressed it smooth. It took 6 minutes. She had never skipped it. The object she carried in her left smock pocket was not the flask. The flask was in the right. In the left pocket was a photograph, laminated because the original had started to fray at the edges. It showed a woman in her late 50s standing in front of a building whose sign was not visible in the frame. The woman had Adeze's same jaw and her same way of standing, weight slightly forward, chin level, as if the ground beneath her was something she had personally decided to trust. The photograph was 31 years old. Adeze's mother had been dead for 19 of those years, and Adeze touched the pocket, not the photograph itself, 3 times a day. Once when she arrived, once at the midpoint of her shift, once before she left. She had one skill that had nothing to do with cleaning. She had been doing it quietly, without announcement, for 7 years, while working her full shift, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. The administration did not know about it. The other cleaners knew, because you cannot keep certain things hidden from people who share a break room, but they had never told anyone in management, because there was an unspoken agreement among the cleaning staff at Corlebu that what happened in the break room was its own country with its own laws. What Adeze did in the break room, in the 40 minutes she was allotted between her morning corridor and her afternoon ward rounds, was study. Mrs. Vivian Obeng Asante was 44 years old, stood in heels that added 4 inches to a height already comfortable, and wore a fur coat in October in Accra because she had lived in London for 12 years and had returned with opinions about what a person of standing wore in public. Her husband was Chief Emmanuel Obeng Asante, the largest private donor to Corlebu's oncology wing for 3 consecutive years. She was here today because she had called ahead about the room she had been promised, the room that was apparently being disputed. She placed her palms on the front desk counter and waited for the receptionist to finish the sentence she was currently in the middle of saying to someone else. The receptionist, whose name was Blessing and whose name tag said so, finished her sentence, turned, and looked at Mrs. Obeng Asante with the particular expression that reception staff develop after long exposure to certain categories of visitor. "Mrs. Obeng Asante, how can I help you?" "The private suite on the East Wing, room 12. I was told it was being held for my mother's transfer from Tema. I am being told now that it is occupied." "Room 12 was assigned this morning, ma'am. There was a medical. I don't need the explanation. I need the room." Down the corridor behind them, Adeze moved her mop in slow, careful passes. She did not turn to look. She had been in this corridor for 11 years, and she knew this conversation. She had heard it 17 times in different forms. The formula was always the same. Someone arrived who believed their money entitled them to something that belonged to someone else, and the person behind the counter found a way to give it to them. And the person who had already been given it learned that given was a provisional word. Blessing reached for the phone. The cleaning cart hit a small ridge in the linoleum near the East Corridor junction, and the bucket shifted with a soft metallic sound. Adeze steadied it without looking down. She had learned that ridge in the second week. She knew every ridge on every floor of this building. By 11:30, the room had been reassigned. Adeze found this out not because anyone told her, but because she was cleaning the corridor outside room 12 when the orderly came to inform the current occupant, a 73-year-old woman named Afia, who had arrived from the general ward 3 days ago, that she would need to return to the general ward by 2 o'clock. Afia sat in the bed with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into something that was not crying and not acceptance. It was a third thing for which there is no clean word, the particular expression of a person who has learned not to be surprised by the distance between what they were told and what was actually going to happen. Adeze stood in the doorway with her mop. The orderly left. "Do you want me to come back later?" Adeze said. "You can clean," Afia said. "I have to sit here anyway." Adeze cleaned. She worked around Afia's bedside table carefully, moved the small vase of artificial flowers Afia had placed there, a yellow rose and 2 white ones, silk, carried from home in a plastic bag, and set it back in exactly the same position. Afia watched this. "You always clean that carefully?" she said. "I clean things the way I would want them cleaned," Adeze said. This was the longest sentence she had said to anyone all morning. By 2 o'clock, Afia had been returned to the general ward. By 2:30, Mrs. Obeng Asante's mother had been settled into room 12, and Mrs. Obeng Asante had briefly toured the room, found the lighting inadequate, the window orientation unacceptable, and the nurse assigned to her mother insufficiently senior, and had communicated all of these concerns to the ward administrator in a voice that carried past 3 closed doors. Adeze heard it from the break room. She set down her flask, opened her notebook, and continued reading where she had left off. The notebook had a blue cover and had once been a general ledger someone had left in the storage room. She had been using it for 2 years. The pages were dense with her handwriting, which was small and slanted and precise in the way of someone who had learned to write when paper was not something you wasted. She was 3 months from an examination she had been preparing to take for 4 years. She had failed it twice. The first time by 9 marks. The second time by 4. She had not told anyone about the failures except the HR clerk on the 3rd floor, and only because the clerk had asked why she needed the afternoon of the examination, date-free, and Adaize had decided that honesty was simpler than an excuse. The clerk had said nothing except that she would mark it in the schedule. The 3rd attempt was in February. If this story is landing where I think it is, stay with me. Because what Adaize does next with the 11 years she has spent in this building is not something the woman in room 12's corridor ever saw coming. The afternoon went the way afternoons in the East Wing went. Adaize finished her break room corridor, moved to the 2nd floor stairwell, cleaned the stairwell from landing to landing, and was halfway through the corridor outside the Oncology Administration office at 4:14 p.m. When the door opened, and Dr. Osai came out with a folder under his arm and his reading glasses still on, which meant he had left quickly. He nearly stepped into her bucket. "Sorry, Adaize," he said. He always used her name. He was one of 6 people in this building who did. "No problem, doctor." He stopped. He had been walking fast, and he stopped, which meant something had made him stop, and he turned and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. "Were you here this morning, East Wing?" "Yes. Did you see what happened with the room 12 situation?" She looked at him. "I was cleaning the corridor." He looked at the folder in his hand. "Do you know who Afia Asiedu is?" She thought. Older woman. 70-something. Was in room 12. Her daughter is a professor of oncological nursing at the University of Ghana Medical School. She's been admitted for a procedure that requires post-operative quiet. A private room for at least 6 days. He was not telling Adaize this because she needed to know. He was telling her because he was a man who processed difficult things by saying them to whoever happened to be in the corridor. "We don't have another private room available until Thursday at the earliest." Adaize said nothing. She moved the mop. She thought about Afia's hands folded in her lap. The third thing that wasn't crying and wasn't acceptance. "Where is she now?" She said. "General ward, bed 9. She nodded once. Dr. Osei went down the corridor with his folder. The plaque at the end of the East Wing had been there since March. It was bronze, mounted at eye level beside the entrance to the hospital's new outpatient records management system, a system that had been in development for 6 years and had launched finally in March, and was currently being praised in a hospital management publication that Adaize had not read, but that Dr. Osei had mentioned to her once, in passing. In a corridor, because he was the kind of man who mentioned things in passing that turned out to be significant. The plaque said, "Records Management and Patient Information Infrastructure, Development and Implementation. Project Lead Consultant. A Mensa." The A did not stand for what Mrs. Obeng Asante, had she ever looked at it, would have thought it stood for. Adaize had been the records clerk in the outpatient department for 2 years before the administration had made a budget decision in 2019 that had reclassified her position. She had been offered a transfer to the cleaning staff at the same pay grade or termination. She had taken the cleaning staff. She had not stopped studying. She had not stopped working, and she had, in the 12 months before the reclassification, completed a documentation of the hospital's patient records infrastructure that had identified 47 systemic errors, developed a proposed correction protocol, submitted it to the administration in a 43-page report, and waited. The report sat in a drawer for 2 years. In 2021, a new hospital director arrived. His name was Director Asante Kofi, and he was not related to Chief Obeng Asante, though the similar surname would have caused confusion if anyone had been paying the kind of attention that would have made the confusion worth resolving. Director Asante Kofi had read the report. He had read it because the outgoing director's assistant had found it in the drawer while cleaning out the office and had left it in the in tray not knowing what else to do with it. And Director Asante Kofi had a policy of reading everything in his in tray before he replaced it with his own. He had read the 43 pages in one sitting. He had then spent 4 weeks trying to find the person who had written them. He had found her at 11:20 a.m. on a Thursday in February 2022, mopping the East Corridor. He had stood and watched her work for a moment before he introduced himself, and when he did introduce himself, he said, "Are you the Adeze Mensah who wrote the 2019 patient records report?" She had wrung the mop, looked at him, and said, "Yes." He had asked her 3 questions about the report. She had answered all 3 without referring to anything. He had asked one follow-up question that was not in the report, a question about cross-referencing methodology, and she had answered it in 2 sentences. He had said, "Why are you cleaning floors?" She had said, "Because I was offered cleaning or termination." He had looked at her for a moment. "That changes today," he said. But it had not changed immediately, because the budget reclassification had created a structural complication that required 3 months to resolve, and then a hiring freeze had extended it further, and Director Asante Kofi was a thorough man rather than a fast one. And so what happened was that Adeze continued cleaning floors while her consultant contract was being processed, and she had cleaned floors during the full 18 months of the record system development, because she had decided that the work was the work, and the floor did not clean itself. The plaque had gone up in March. She had attended the small ceremony in her cleaned and pressed uniform. She had stood at the back. Nobody from the cleaning staff had been invited. Technically, she had been listed on the ceremony attendance as a consultant. But she had stood at the back anyway because it was the back where she could see everything, and she had watched Director Asante Kofi say her name in front of the hospital board, and she had felt the photograph in her left pocket without touching it, and had thought about her mother standing in front of a building whose sign was not visible in the frame. The fur coat appeared in the East Corridor at 4:47 p.m. Mrs. Vivian Obeng Asante was not looking for Adeze. She was looking for the ward administrator to repeat the conversation about the inadequate lighting, and she came around the East Corridor junction at a pace that suggested she had been walking at that pace all day and had not needed to slow down once. She slowed down now. The plaque was at eye level. She stopped. She read it. She read it a second time. She turned and looked down the corridor, and at the far end of the corridor, Adeze Mensah was guiding a cleaning cart around the corner toward the storage room, back straight, pace even, the purple flask visible in the right pocket of her pale blue uniform. Mrs. Obeng Asante stood in front of the plaque for 43 seconds. This is not an estimate. There was a clock on the wall above the plaque, and the time was visible in the security camera footage that Director Asante Kofi reviewed the following morning. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he had developed the habit of reviewing the corridor footage near the records wing when anything of significance occurred, and what had occurred the following morning was significant enough that he had wanted to understand the sequence. What Mrs. Obeng Asante did next was not what any corridor in this building had ever witnessed before from a woman in a fur coat. She walked to the storage room. She knocked. Adeze opened the door. The 2 women looked at each other. Adese's hand was still on the door handle. Mrs. Obeng Asante's handbag was in the crook of her elbow. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "That plaque," Mrs. Obangasante said. "The record system. Yes, that is your work." It was not a question, but Adeze answered it. "Yes," Mrs. Obangasante looked at her. Something was happening in her face that was not the expression she had arrived at the reception desk with. It was more effortful, more internal. "This morning," she said, "in the corridor." It was an accident," Adeze said. They both knew it was not. "My mother is in room 12, Mrs. Obangasante said. The previous occupant was moved to the general ward. "I know. I did not know. It's all right," Adeze said. "I'll be done in here in a few minutes." She turned back to the storage room. Mrs. Obangasante stood in the doorway. "Can I ask you something?" Adeze turned around. "Why are you still cleaning floors?" And Adeze looked at this woman. The coat, the heels, the handbag, the orange blossom, the full architecture of a life organized around being seen as significant. And she said the truest sentence of the afternoon. "Because the floors need to be clean." She said it without bitterness, without performance. She said it the way she had always done things, because the thing needed doing, and she was the person doing it, and that had always been enough. That evening, Adeze arrived at the general ward to find Afia Asiedo sitting up in bed 9, with her silk flowers on the bedside table, the yellow rose and the 2 white ones, arranged in the same position they had been in room 12. She had brought the tea, not from her flask. A full container sealed from the canteen. Ginger, she placed it on the table beside the flowers. Afia looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," Afia said. "I know," Adeze said. She sat for 11 minutes. They did not speak very much. The ward was its usual evening sound, monitors, footsteps, the ventilation system that had needed servicing since December. When Adeze left, she touched her left pocket once, briefly, and walked to the bus stop at the corner of the hospital's main gate. 2 days later, Director Asante Kofi called her into his office and placed a letter on the desk in front of her. The letter was from the Ghana Health Service. It was addressed to A. Mensah, lead consultant, patient records infrastructure, Korlebu Teaching Hospital. It was an invitation to serve on the National Records Digitization Advisory Committee, a paid consultancy. 18 months, the kind of appointment that generated a different category of name tag. Director Asante Kofi leaned back in his chair. "The February exam," he said. "When you pass it, and you will, the position we discussed becomes official." He paused. "The advisory role begins in April regardless." Adeze looked at the letter. She read it in full. She turned it over, as if checking whether the back contained something different, which it did not. She looked up. "I still have 3 months of shift remaining on my contract," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "The floors will still need cleaning, Adeze," he said. "We have staff. I'll finish my contract," she said. Not as defiance, as completion, as the particular precision of a person who understood that the thing that had built her was not the difficulty of the work, but the doing of it without requiring anyone to notice. She took the letter, folded it twice along a clean crease, and placed it in her left pocket alongside the photograph. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning, she submitted her final timesheet to the HR department and cleaned the East Corridor one last time, working from the storage room end to the reception junction, past the plaque at eye level, past the door to room 12 where a new patient now rested, down to the front entrance where the linoleum met the threshold, and the light changed from inside to outside. She wrung the mop. She placed it in the cart. She stood for a moment with the light on her. She thought about her mother, the jaw, the way of standing. weight slightly forward, chin level, as if the ground beneath her was something she had personally decided to trust. The building went on behind her. Corridors and corridors of it, all the small decisions that a person makes when no one is awarding them anything for making them. She pressed her hand flat against the left pocket. Then she walked toward the life that had been waiting for her since before she had known it was waiting. The morning Mrs. Obeng Asante kicked that mop, she saw a cleaner. She saw pale blue, a bucket, a woman the corridor had absorbed. She saw someone the building used, but did not need to remember. What she did not see, what the building itself had almost failed to see, was the 43 pages. The 11 years. The February morning, and the 9-mark failure, and the 4-mark failure, and the notebook with the blue cover filled with the handwriting of someone who had decided that the floor does not stop needing to be clean just because the person cleaning it deserves something more. You cannot always see what a person is carrying. You cannot see it in the uniform or the bucket or the quiet way they move through a space that was not designed to hold them. But it is there. It has always been there. The recognition is not the thing. The work is the thing. The recognition is only proof that the thing was real. Some people build their lives out of what the world gave them. Others build theirs out of what the world refused to. And the difference between those two buildings is not in the materials. It is in who the builder decided to be when the corridor was empty and no one was watching, and the floor needed to be clean. If someone told you tomorrow that your work had been sitting in a drawer for 2 years, that the 43 pages you gave everything to write had been filed away and forgotten, would you stop working? Or would you press your hand flat against your pocket, pick up the mop and keep going until the corridor was done? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.